Welcome to the Evidential Faith Podcast, where a father-son duo explore the scientific, historical, and philosophical evidence for the God of the Bible. The goal of this podcast is to encourage believers and challenge skeptics to consider the reliability of Jesus in the Bible. Welcome back, podcast listeners, to the Evidential Faith Podcast. My name is Jake Nash, and with me, as always, is my co-host and my dad, Troy Nash. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. If you are a stud and are keeping up week to week, you may have noticed that we were off last week. We've decided to go down to every other week, make it a little bit more sustainable, allow us to do better research. So, I think this will be a good upload schedule. I've heard a lot of feedback from our listeners that it takes them a while to get through the episodes because they're pretty dense. So everybody I listen to is a few episodes behind anyways. So this will be good, and it'll allow us to do even more research and make it even more dense. So, but without further ado, we're going to get into today's episode. So in the last few episodes, we discussed different arguments for God's existence, all of which being very scientific in nature. This week, we're going to wrap up our series on the arguments for God's existence with a more philosophical argument. That is the moral argument, which was kind of popularized and developed over the years by many people, including Immanuel Kant, C.S. Lewis, and William Lane Craig. As always, we're going to discuss the moral argument as a whole, and then we're going to dive into each of the premises to see if the argument is not only valid, but to see if it's true. And then we'll discuss some common objections along the way and misconceptions held by atheists or by secularists. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the moral argument. So, Dad, if you want to take it away and tell them what that's all about.
Yeah, so the basic moral argument for God's existence goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. The second part of the premise is that objective morals and values do exist, therefore God must exist. So we're going to break down each one of these first two arguments, and hopefully we can show that God does exist because of objective morals. So before we jump into the first premise, let's get some definitions down here. So what do we mean by objective moral values? Moral rights and wrongs, or good and evil, that are true regardless of human opinion. In other words, they are true for every person, in every place, at every time. Mm-hmm. An example would be, we could objectively say that torturing babies for fun is objectively wrong. No matter where you live, no matter who you are, it is objectively wrong.
Yep.
And if that is case, then we would argue that God exists because of that objective value. All right, so an objective moral duty is an obligation that we're bound to follow. Things like you ought not steal. These are oughts, like you ought not murder. Yeah. You ought not steal. You ought not, commit adultery. Things like that. Those are objective moral duties. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, if God does not exist, objective morals and values do not exist. All right, so Jake, do you want to go ahead and jump on this one and take it further?
Yeah. So now that we kind of know the definitions of what an objective moral value and duty is, let's go ahead and see if the first premise, if God does not exist, then moral objective values and duties do not exist, is true. In other words, what we're saying with this first premise is, without God, there is no solid foundation for objective morality. Now, this premise does not claim that someone who doesn't believe in God can't be a moral person. That's not what we're saying. We know plenty of people who don't believe in God who are moral people. What the premise does mean is that without God, there is no basis or foundation for objective morality. In other words, it is God himself that determines objective morality, not the belief in him. So you can be a moral person without believing in God, but there is no basis for objective morality in that. So if there's no God, then we can define our morals however we want. And so if my morals don't align with your morals, on what basis can you say that I'm wrong? Well, you can't, because it's all a matter of opinion. If I think that stealing is fine and you think that stealing is bad, but there's no objective morals, there is no right or wrong. And atheists agree with this. Jean-Paul Sartre, who is an atheist existentialist, wrote in his work Existentialism is a Humanism in 1946 that everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist. So atheists agree with this. And in order for there to be objective moral values that apply to every person in every place at every time, there has to be something outside of our mind, culture, or society that defines what is good and what is evil. And we think the best explanation for this is God for two reasons. The first reason is that the Bible describes God as perfect, holy, and righteous. Deuteronomy 32:4 says, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. And this isn't just saying that God does good, he is good. Goodness flows from his nature, so he gets to define what is right and what is wrong. He defines what is good and evil. He is the source of morality. Mm-hmm. So the second reason we think that God is the basis for objective morality is that the Bible describes God as a judge. So Isaiah 33:22 says, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us." Romans 2:15-16 says, "They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus." And so this is calling God a judge, right? And this kind of explains why we feel an obligation to do what is right, because we're held accountable to God and his law. You don't feel an obligation to do something if you're not accountable for that thing. And right. So whether or not you're a Christian, the Bible says that God's moral law is written on our hearts. So that's why we inherently know what is right and wrong.
Right. Yeah, without God, there is no ultimate justice either. It's not just right. There is no morals, there's no ultimate justice. So without him, someone like Hitler pays no ultimate price for what he did.
Yeah.
He gets to just die and go away. Ultimately, God will judge Hitler and people like Hitler in a very harsh way in what we would call hell for eternity.
Yeah, exactly. So, I totally agree. And I think, yeah, you've kind of just jumped off onto the next point. So why don't you take it away? Like we know that there are objective morals. We know this in our life. So the first premise again that we just talked about is that without God, objective morals can't exist. Mm-hmm. And we showed that because the basis of God being the judge, God being the ultimate provider of these objective morals. He's the one that sets the foundation. Kind of a catchy way to say that is a moral law requires a moral law giver, right? So right. He is the moral law giver in that case. So the next premise is that objective moral values and duties do indeed exist. So Dad, do you want to talk about why we believe that it actually does exist?
Yeah. So in other words, some things are truly right and other things are absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
Torturing innocent people really is wrong. You
mm-hmm.
can have, we can absolutely say that. And love, justice, compassion really are good. It's not just our own opinion. Those things are good.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a popular belief among secularists and atheists is that objective moral values and duties do not exist. That's just a matter of opinion. Again, they believe that we basically evolved our morals through society determining what was best for the flourishing of that society. Well,
yep.
If that society is, in the opinion of that society, if it's not wrong to gas 6 million Jews, for example, then who is some other society to tell the Nazis that is absolutely wrong?
Right.
It's just one society versus the opinions versus another society's opinions. And what is it? The whichever society has the strongest military gets to decide what the moral values are?
Yeah. It's a very Darwinist opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So even Richard Dawkins, so he has a famous quote. Richard Dawkins is a well-known atheist, and he has a quote that there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Yeah.
Wow, what a thing to say about the world that we live in, that who we are, that there is nothing, there is no evil, there is no good. I mean, we clearly know that there is good and there is evil. Philosopher Nietzsche says, there's a quote attributed to him that says, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, it does not exist." So I think, people need to take, a long, hard look at this and really think about it. Is there objective morality? Do these things exist? And we say that they do exist. While this might be an interesting philosophical belief that he spouts, it isn't consistent with the world that we actually live in. There is good evidence that objective morals exist for 3 reasons. First is moral intuition. In general, we have a moral sense that we trust to perceive what is right and wrong. That's why we get outraged when we hear about innocent people getting hurt or killed. And Jake, you had a story that you wanted to talk about the Idaho murder case.
Yeah. So if we're recording this podcast in 2025, and 3 years ago when my wife and I were in college, we heard about this horrible murder case in Idaho. I don't even know. Have you heard about this? The Brian Koberger case?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big case.
Where this guy Brian Koberger went into this college house in Idaho in the middle of the night and brutally murdered 4 people in their sleep, stabbing them to death dozens of times each. And then he went to jail, and his trial was this year, and he just got a plea deal for life in prison. He got out of the death sentence because he pleaded guilty, and people are calling for justice and saying, why does he get to live when the other 4 people that he decided to take their life? And so we know in our heart that we desire justice, and without justice, without something that is just, there can't be something that's unjust. C.S. Lewis says, you can't call a line crooked unless you know what a straight line is. Mm-hmm. You can't say something is unjust unless you know what justice is. And true justice, objective justice. And that's also why we say things like, that's not fair when somebody wrongs us. Like a kid who got 1 piece of candy when his friend got 2. He says, that's not fair. And to say something is not fair assumes that there's an objective standard for what is fair. If there wasn't, nothing would ever be unfair. It would just be beneficial for one party and not the other. And,
right.
Even people like Richard Dawkins, he says, what was the quote that he said? There's no good, no evil, no purpose, no design, nothing but a blind, pitiless indifference.
Pitiless indifference, yeah.
He says that, he believes that, but in reality, he contradicts himself. He's also famously said, and I'm going to do my best because he uses some big words here, but in his book, The God Delusion, there's a quote. He says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, anti-fascistal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, malevolent bully." Sadomasochistic, malevolent bully. Mm-hmm. So this is the same man that said there's no evil and no good.
Yeah, so what is he basing this on?
Right, think about
it. What basis is he calling him a...
That's what I'm saying. How can Richard Dawkins call God an unpleasant, unjust bully if he also says there's no such thing as right or wrong?
Right.
If objective morality doesn't exist, then Dawkins can't say anything is good or anything is bad. He can't call God evil, because what is justice? He can't call him unjust, because what is justice? But yet even Dawkins admits that there is some standard for good when he calls God evil. We all intuitively know that there's an objective standard for good and evil. So
yeah, ultimately, evil is just it's basically we don't know, we can't know what evil is unless we know what good is.
Yeah, exactly.
Because evil comes out of
evil is
good.
the absence of good.
It's the absence of good. So it's like the crooked line and the straight line. We can't know what evil is unless we know what good is.
Yeah.
And so without God, we don't know what good is.
Yeah. So the second reason you want to talk about this is the second
Yeah,
reason why we believe objective moral values exist.
right. And this has to do with widespread agreement on core values throughout
Mm-hmm.
cultures, over history, across cultures, times, and religions. There's a surprising degree of agreement on moral principles.
Yeah.
Some examples of these was, don't murder innocent people. When Hitler murdered 6 million Jews, this without God, we can't say he's wrong,
Yeah.
right? So, but across cultures, across religions, across times, we know that he was wrong. They went to trial. The Nazis went to war crimes trial and during the Nuremberg trials, and the defense attorney for the Nazis argued that how can one society claim that what we did was wrong when what we did was in our belief correct? We believed that this was advancing society by killing these people who we felt were
Wow.
in superior or not, were less superior to the ultimate race that we wanted. And so what the prosecution's claim was that it's not our society. There's a higher authority that we are judging you under. That we are saying that this is wrong by a basis of a higher authority, not just on the basis of
My
one
opinion versus
society.
yours.
Yeah, not just on the basis of opinion, that there's a higher authority.
Yeah.
Some other examples across cultures is that people know that it's wrong to steal. It doesn't prevent them from doing it, but they know ultimately that it's wrong to steal. And it's also wrong to do terrible things to children. Kidnapping children, raping children, doing all those things are across cultures and across, doesn't matter where you live in the world, you know that it's wrong to treat children immorally.
Yeah.
Also, telling the truth is another example of across cultures, that these are examples of morals and moral principles that hold true. Be loyal to family and tribe. If morality was relative, we'd expect to see different cultures with vastly different morals. But even ancient cultures that never contacted one another had similar morals. Critics might say that some cultures have done terrible things like genocide and slavery. Doesn't that disprove a universal morality? And not at all. The existence of moral failures doesn't disprove a moral standard. In fact, it proves the standard. We know that slavery and genocide are wrong only because we have an objective standard by which to judge them by.
Yeah. Again,
So
it's
morals
the
aren't
crooked versus
just
straight line. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So morals aren't just constructed by a society, or they're not just evolved. That we didn't. These things didn't just evolve as society evolved. These are written on our hearts, like you said. That these are written on our hearts by God. If any, so here's a quote by C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity, and he says, "If anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teaching of, say, the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Hindus, the Chinese, the Greeks, the Romans, what will really strike him is how very like they are to each other and to our own." So all these cultures are very similar in how they view right and wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, you touched on something there a little bit that kind of leads right into the third reason why we believe that objective morality does exist. You said, it didn't just evolve. And a lot of people believe that, right? And they point to moral progress, saying, our standard for morality is better now than it was, say, when slavery was legal in the United States or during the Holocaust. But in reality, moral progress, like, that's not evolution. That doesn't disprove the standard. It proves it. Moral progress implies a moral standard. You can't say you're getting closer to something, closer to perfection, unless you have a goal you're trying to reach. Right. You can't say you're getting healthier unless you look at the scale and you're losing weight, or you're building muscle, or you pass a test. You can't say you're closer to passing a test if you don't know what the bar is, right? So if morality is subjective, then there isn't any progress upon the past. There's only change. And if that's the case, like we said a couple times, then Nazi Germany wouldn't be any worse than a modern democracy. They're just different. Or the United States back before the Civil War wouldn't be any worse than it is now. It's just different. But we can say that American slavery was wrong and that the Holocaust was wrong, and there's progress there, and that's amazing. But that's not just unguided evolution. That's progress towards a moral standard.
Right. I think it's kind of important to point out here that it was Christians that fought back against the Nazis,
and Christians that fought back against slavery too.
Right, exactly.
Right?
So
there were
Dietrich
people,
Bonhoeffer,
yeah.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor in Germany, and he fought against the Nazis. In fact, he tried to have Hitler assassinated and taken out because he knew what they were doing was totally immoral. He ended up being hung by the Nazis, but then also, like you mentioned, slavery was the critical person involved in the abolishment of slavery that led this charge was a Christian.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's we know that that there is objective morality out there, and that God is the standard for it.
Right. So going back to the original argument, the premise one is that without God, there cannot exist objective moral values, and we explain that by saying that God himself is the uncaused cause. He is the moral law giver that creates the moral law. He's outside of any time, space, and matter, and so he creates the objective law. He's like a game maker who makes the rules of the game, right? And the Bible says this in Romans and in Isaiah and in Deuteronomy. So that's premise one, and I think that there's good evidence for that. And premise two is that objective moral values do indeed exist.
Yeah.
So if objective moral values do exist, and they can only exist with God, therefore God must exist because objective moral values do exist.
Okay, your mic kind of cut out.
Okay, I think it'll be okay.
Okay.
It was probably the internet, but I think we'll be okay.
Okay.
So yeah, that's the moral argument in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great argument. Before we leave, I do want to touch on one more thing, and I think we're going to we'll probably do a whole episode on this in the future. But I do want to touch a little bit on the problem of evil, because
it's a big
it's
one for
hard
people
to bring up the moral argument without people bringing up the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Understandably so. Many people point to the existence of evil and say, see how much evil is in the world? How could a good God exist? How could a God, especially a good God, exist? And I totally get why people think that. I 100% understand, because I used to think that.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah. We've both seen a lot of evil and a lot of hurt and a lot of pain in our lives. And so I totally resonate with people, and I have compassion towards them when they believe that, because I was there. But we're not going to get into why evil exists, and I believe that there is a good explanation for evil, or why it's here. We're not going to get into that right now, because we'll do that in a future episode. But I do want to leave the listeners with a quote from Ravi Zacharias as to why the existence of evil does not disprove God. So when somebody asked him, when somebody asked Ravi, how can there be a God if there's so much evil? He said this: when you say there's too much evil in this world, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. That's what we just talked about. But if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral law giver. But that's who you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral law giver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. And if there's no good, there's no evil. So what's your question?
Yeah.
In very simple terms, evil does not disprove God, it proves him. Because in order to know what evil is, you have to know what good is. And in order to know what good is, you have to look at God.
Yep.
So that's the moral argument.
People might have to read that quote a few times to really let it sink in, but
yeah,
it's true. If if evil exists, then good exists, and if good exists, then God exists. So.
Yep. Well,
All right.
what a great episode. So that rounds out our last episode on the different arguments for God's existence. Now, we are obviously Christians, and so we believe that God is the God of the Bible. There's one true God. It's the God of the Bible. It's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that Christianity is the one true religion. However, we have not given any evidence to show that that's the case yet, right? We've only touched mainly on, does a God exist? We haven't answered the question of who that God is. So
Right.
in this next series, we're going to talk about what is the evidence for who God is, because I think we've made a pretty good case that God exists, but who is it? Is it the God of Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism? Which of these major religions got it right? And so, stay tuned for the next few episodes. We're going to talk about that evidence and just dive deeper into God's world and what is his fingerprints that he's left on this world. So,
Yeah. Not all the religions of the world can be right.
right, because
They can all be wrong, but they can't all be right because they disagree
why
on.
is that? Yeah.
Because they disagree on the facts around God and who God is. So we'll get into that.
Yep, it'll
That'll
be fun.
a good one. All right.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. Give us a like and subscribe on YouTube and on Spotify, and we'll see you not next week, but the next week. Bye, guys.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Bye.